in this episode.
Philosophers are bad at politics and religion. And like they're not supposed to, because they are different things. But like, with every like political work, every philosophical work, you often see like the conclusion will involve something to do with like tearing with the negative and tearing with the contradictory and tearing with the ambiguity. And it's like, yeah, that's easy for you to say. That's easy for people with like otium and like philosophical training, or I would just say, if we're going to be honest, like I think there are natural differences. Some people, their strengths are more like in the verbal area. They're more like, existentially intelligent, some more practically, like there's different kinds of intelligence and abilities people have. I think a lot of people like, and you could say this is partially societal and that we're not encouraged to like think deeply about a lot of stuff. When people are there to sit with their own thoughts, as they did during COVID, I think, part of why you got mass psychosis is because like people like don't want to deal with the negative and deal with contradiction. There's hit with like a lot of
the uncertainty.
They just want to escape immediately. And I think part of that is like, I don't think there's a part of that I don't think is new, which is like humans are a pattern seeking species fundamentally. Like religion has always been a feature of human society in some way or form, right? And so there's a craving for that. There's absolutely a craving for that. That's no secret. I think spirituality fulfills a component that religion fulfills without a lot of the other components. So it fulfills that kind of like meaning crisis only temporarily, but it doesn't really work, because the thing about spirituality is because spirituality is like a subjective relationship of the person. So it's like other people, if you believe this, for example, like I can say I believe in a mixture of pantheistic ideas, and I think the universe is this way, and like I like to read about Sufism here, Buddhism here, and like this is my reality. Okay, all right, so what?
There is no doubt that we'll all come across that stereotypical person who identifies as spiritual but not religious.
But the people are retarded.
In fact, this isn't just a belief held by the quintessential New Age spiritualist who fetishizes Eastern culture, but rather, as Tony Chamas puts it, since the 60s and still to this day, the prevailing view of the urban secular normie in North America, and I would add Australia and most of the Western world, when it comes to religion, can be captured in a single ubiquitous phrase: I'm spiritual but not religious. But could it be that the post-1960s secular, quote-unquote, spiritual normie worldview is not only banal and existentially vacuous, but impossible to live by? What if subjective belief is not as important as we're told by contemporary ideologies? What if one's personal truth is ultimately a public act, not an inner reality? Or in other words, could it be that what you believe does not matter as much?
I don't believe in going deep into your inner self. Sorry to be brutal, if you go deep into it, you find deep shit there, I claim. Monstrous fantasies and so on. I believe that the only way to overcome yourself is to identify with your mask. Just to conclude, that I don't drag on, my favorite movie here, Rossellini, you should see it, you can get it on YouTube, from 1960, I think, with Vittorio General della Rovere. De Sica plays a poor guy who is caught, it's still occupied Italy, caught by the Nazis, and since he looks exactly like General della Rovere, a big name of resistance, they tell him, we killed della Rovere, but resistance that we have in prison don't know this. So go there, pretend that you are General della Rovere, and people will confide in you, and you will tell us that. You can guess what is the ending. He identifies so much to his role that he is ready to die. He doesn't say anything, and he is shot publicly as General della Rovere. In this sense, I am for good alienation. Who cares about his real self, a poor beggar, and so on? In this complete identification with another, you can find freedom, but also horror. Did you see with Jim Carrey, his best film, I think, did you see The Mask? Where he is completely free, but nightmare comes out. This complete freedom to do what you want, he experiences it as a nightmare. So in this more precise sense, I think that first there is something liberating in games and cliches. Can you imagine how horrible life would have been if you were to tell just the truth sincerely, without hypocrisy? There is no life without hypocrisy. Hypocrisy gives me, and it works. That's a game. I will conclude. Don't be afraid. I know.
I'm definitely taking you to
evil,
theme 3.
Evil French spirit. I see it. Yeah. No. Look, I meet you, let's say, or you on the street, and I say, I'm so glad to meet you. What if in my mind, as it's probably the case because I'm an evil guy, shit, why didn't I note you 1 minute earlier to go to the other side of the road? And we both know it. But nonetheless, although we know that this is mostly a hypocritical, empty forum, it works performatively as a sign of kindness. This is for me a good alienation. I hate people who open themselves up, and I don't want to hear them. I mean, all the dirty deeds. We need...
Writer, video essayist, and political commentator Tony from One Dime argues so, and I should add, he does so convincingly. He writes in his Substack essay, "Spirituality without religion seems appealing to many precisely because it lacks an authoritative structure. However, spirituality without religion is without any structure at all. It is really about belief alone. If one looks at belief psychoanalytically, it is far less important than practice, as belief often boils down to wish fulfillment. Individual belief can lead to productive action if it is used to fill the will rather than mollify the mind, and in some cases, belief can even be manifested into reality. But most of the time, at an individual level, belief functions as subconscious wish fulfillment and a way to rationalize for coping. In contrast, belief as action require others to believe it too." Tony, I know you're watching this. Thank you, mate, for making time for the podcast. It was great fun speaking with you, and I hope you, the listener, find it as insightful as I did after this quick PSA. As you may know, I've mentioned multiple times that I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. Frankly, I think we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you another product or service that you probably don't need. That being said though, and forgive me for the tautology, we, for better or worse, live in the world we live in. I run this podcast on top of doing a full-time job while doing research for my master's, and if I am to sustain this project, I need some financial backing. So if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. All the links will be in the show notes. And if you're wondering, what are the perks? What are you going to get? The honest answer is nothing. That's right, there's no exclusive behind the paywall goodies. As far as I'm concerned, you're simply supporting this project if you think the already free content that's always going to be free is of any value to you. I sincerely do want to thank the existing supporters, and if you're considering supporting my work, please do so only if you have the means, especially in our precarious times. Alright, now to the episode. But about Kanye, like, I don't know, I obviously you know more about this than I do, but I find that I like that he is trying to build alternate routes, so like alternate ways of trading that isn't heavily reliant on the US because of what, you know, America is becoming, or the US is becoming. And like, I think a lot of, even like in Australia, so our Prime Minister Albanese, he's still a lot more buddy with the American government, just for like pure realpolitik, like pragmatic reasons, because we have no choice. We kind of have to rely on the US in many ways. But he's also been trying to kind of go the Kanye route and like build bilateral relations with China, and because we're way closer to China right then, like the US for instance. Get what I mean, right? Like in that regard, like I like that within the given, because I mean, I find this in a lot of your work too, where, yeah, you're a leftist, but you try to take a bit more of a pragmatic approach to, some kind of moderately conservative communist, let's say, the way Zizek would put it.
So I'll say I like the word socialist these days more than leftist. Leftist is like, I mean, I won't if you say I'm on the left, I'll never I'll accept that, like, on the left. Leftist?
Is that because, so kind of tying this back to that previous one I was making, is that because you feel like the contemporary left are just like, for lack of a better term, a bunch of wankers who just have like, there's no pragmatic plan, just like, I care about all these like esoteric social issues or whatever, but aren't really, because like for me, I would say I'm a leftist in this regard. I fundamentally care about class politics, and I am a socialist to some extent too. Like I do think, liberating the working, like really like traditional orthodox kind of, I do believe that liberating the working class matters.
Yeah.
And these sorts of things. Of course, especially I've learned from folks like yourself, there are these other dimensions to it, really good critiques that come from like the Frankfurt School, or even like people like Byung-Chul Han of, liberal capitalism.
Oh, Byung-Chul Han's definitely not a leftist, but yeah.
I don't think he is. Yeah, I don't even know what, he comes to me as like a Schopenhauerian, like just pessimist, to be honest. But I'm curious why you would say that, like, why you're not a leftist but like a socialist.
Well, even socialist is like, it depends what you mean, but I would say definitely not a leftist, in the sense that leftist implies like being left on everything. And, it's like being a rightist, right? Like someone who's socially conservative, are they necessarily a right-winger? Or someone might be like socially liberal and be fiscally conservative. That's probably the dominant ideology for quite a while. It's sort of reversing more in the last few years. But leftist just implies left on everything, and on some things, I'm not really particularly left. I would say, like, dispositionally. So everyone's dispositionally, I think, like left or right. They tend in one way. I'm dispositionally way more on the left, in the sense that if you were to deduce it to hierarchy and equality, I have a whole like essay on this called The Concepts of Left and Right, or I might have retitled it called The Left and Right Are Obsolete. I was proud of that essay a lot. But yeah, like, I mean, I would say this, look, so I came to the left for the same principles that I have today. My principles didn't really change. Like, I was driven by one, like, desire to, have a more equal society. Like, I'm kind of, versus naturally, you have a visceral reaction to vast inequality. It's like the Tupac clip, man, where he's like,
it's too much money here. I mean, nobody should be hitting lotto for 36 million and we got people starving in the streets. That is not idealistic. That's just real. That is just stupid. There's no way Michael Jackson should have, or whoever Jackson, should have $1,000,000 billion and then there's people starving. There's no way. There's no way that these people should own planes and their people don't have houses, apartments, shacks, drawers, pants.
He's like, how can you have like all these Jacksons, whatever Jacksons they have, however many million? Then you have the people who are like, on the street who ain't got anything, and people who live a miserable existence. Yeah, just stuff like that. But like leftists, where I would say I'm like, where I break from leftists, I'm just like, I'm not really a progressive.
No, nor am I. Yeah. I wouldn't consider myself progressive either. In particular, like this, like American progressive types, like, the Dave Pacman types. I'm not that. Like I also like which is kind of why I really do appreciate people like Zizek who critique the left from a leftist perspective. Yeah, like, I mean, Trump derangement syndrome or whatever it's called, it's a real thing, Like, I find that this is kind of why I think dialectical thinking is quite important. Like, you can see so much of so-called progressives or so-called leftists or left-wing people, like, they get off on Trump. They get a jouissance from just like constantly all of the shit he's doing. Like, it's like there's a tightly coupled relation between the status quo left and like Trump's antiques, you know. And like the thing is, they don't see how they're enjoying Trumpism by like, you know, look at this terrible fascist, you know, evil, whatever man. And that comes off to me as being a little bit like, firstly, it's so tiring and like, oh, it's boring. You know, like, okay, fine, we get it. You don't like Trump. Get over yourself. But
Well, that's
it's
another
kind of
reason I'm
like
not
pathetic too.
like.
Yeah.
That's another reason I'm not. I don't like the word leftist, because for a lot of people that just means I'm not on the right, or I don't like right wingers, and it's like kind of meaningless. And you know when you said it instantly, like I drew class politics, I'm like, yeah, you're one of the good ones. But like, if we're being honest, is that what makes up the dominant, like is that what makes up the actually existing left, right? Because like when we talk about socialism, right, we talk about like socialism in theory, communism theory, and then we talk about like actually existing socialism, and then that's where you divide the people who think like, oh, do you think actually existing socialism was great and like worth defending, or do you think it was, you know, kind of a failure? And my view of the actually existing left is, you know, it's essentially like professional managerial class project, and you know, project for like PMC elite aspirants, and it takes on a kind of impotent form, and also embraces this whole set of like what I would say are fundamentally deeply capitalistic ideologies that are like rationalized as progressive endeavors, you know, kind of like in some ways as like part of the capitalist superstructure, I would even say, like the new spirit of it. But yeah, it's like I wasn't, you can tell the type of person, what type of leftist you're dealing with, really on how they voted or how they viewed the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primaries. Like if their first person was Bernie Sanders, like who was their second person, or like who are they first? The people who are, you know, who Bernie wasn't their first person were not driven by class politics. They're driven by like something else, you know, identity, gender, or something like that. And that's a lot of people. Like I don't think people truly realize that that's a big part of the left. And you know, so when we talk about like, oh, I'm a leftist, but in this sense, it's like, all right, it's like, I don't know, I get it, because, and that's why I still talk to leftists. I still have many leftist friends. I still, you know, associate myself with those people. Like, you know, I like Catherine Liu, but I mean,
oh, she's fantastic.
You know, yeah, she's great.
I love Catherine Liu. I also like Catherine Liu because she defends the Enlightenment and like reason and all of this, which from like all this lazy, like, you know, postmodern kind of stuff. So, but anyway,
I think leftists would defend stuff like that.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah, it's like, look, it's quite simple. Like, if I was, let's say, like, you know, because I am like small c conservative, but let's say if I was like a political conservative, and the conservative side was failing to conserve anything, it was just like, you know, deregulating capital more and more. It's like, why would I be a conservative? You know, it's like, why would I vote for the conservatives? Why? Like, what are they doing to advance this exactly? Like, are they what they say they are? And that's kind of how I feel about a lot of the actually existing left. I mean, and I do try to like, it's not like I go completely against or anything. I mean, I try to make it at this point the, you know, the left better. It's why I spend so much time talking to leftists and to lefty audiences. And, you know, really every tradition, I think, like every like political side, you want to see do a little better. Like, because what ends up happening is people mirror decay. Like when there's a conservative right-wing side, right? Reactionary side that's increasingly like brain dead, is controlled by like brain dead people. Then it's just easy for leftist people to just forever like be like, oh yeah, that's weird. Like, look, when the critique of modern feminism, for example, or modern like LGBTQ ideology is driven by like people like Andrew Tate, who are literally like 13 IQ people, you know,
they got like
really,
2 neurons. Yeah,
it's gonna be very easy to dismiss critiques of that, because it's like that's what you're up against. It's easy to look at people like that and be like, oh, ew, that's dumb. Like, okay, and yeah, or even just like, I mean, that's itself a very low bar, right?
But yeah, but I think here's what for me
he's enabled by right-wing people, like he's Candace Owens has him on the show, you know, like they want to benefit from its popularity. It's like left-wing people will tolerate a lot of insane nonsense, like be it like Bernie during Black Lives Matter when they snatched the mic from his hand, and it's like he just sat there and took it, because he didn't want to be called racist and challenge it, and also he wanted to kind of ride on the popularity of like those social justice movements, which they were never really that popular. But they thought, okay, why not work with it? Why not go against it? And this is the way in which like leftists enable the worst tendencies on their side, and as that can happen with people on the right too.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm entirely on board, Tony. But then the problem for me, and here's where, like, for me, in fact, I'm curious. I'll ask you this after this. What I'm about to say. I don't think I'd still consider myself to be a political activist, because I really don't do any kind of activism. I mean, I'm rarely even that political. You're probably one of the few political people I follow online and also have as a guest on my podcast, because I'm interested in politics theoretically, but frankly, right now I'm in a sense of like almost like this Kierkegaardian dizziness where I'm like, I'm not sure how to even be a proper activist apart from like really like boring things like, oh, I'm just gonna vote for the proper party, maybe try and give some money, like really like these like lazy things just to like relieve myself of the guilt of existence in some sense, so but
honestly, I like the questions you had written down, like the questions you had written down. I'd be down to just get to those, because those were interesting. And by the way, if you even want to just like cut to this discussion, feel free, it's up to you. But when I was reading through your questions, like what's exciting to me is getting invited for like a Substack article, because I love I think that's my most underrated work, is what I've been putting writing wise, rather than just when I'm like doing video wise. And especially that article, like spiritual but not religious, that was, I think, a sleeper. Like that one for me was one of the favorite things I've written in quite a while. And so yeah, I'm happy to
mate, like
have someone who wants to invite me on, just mainly off of that, which is cool. But you've been following the work you've been following the work for before. You said like for like 2-3 years or whatever.
Bro, like I mean, when I emailed you, I kind of wanted to invite you, but I was also like, you've already had so many good discussions, and I'm like, as an interviewer, I don't think I can ask you anything original that you already haven't been asked before, until I read that article, because I was like, oh, this is something. There are a few things here that I kind of like to. Some threads I'd like to pull, but like again, back to the anti-trade stuff. Like I think my problem is, again, there's like an enjoyment that left-wing people, whoever, that get from constantly like, I don't know, pointing like, oh, look at this buffoon, look at this idiot, look at this like silly fella. Like I think a good example here is people like Kyle Kalinske, Secular Talk on YouTube. Great, I love him. But if you look at like his videos, it's constantly, oh, look at how stupid Trump is, look at how stupid the right is. And I'm like, okay, fine. Like is there like a positive political project that you're trying to build here?
It's slop content.
But
like I'll be honest.
It's just slop content. I don't really see.
Left-wing Fox News.
Yeah,
and
that's it, mate. Yeah. Look, great, man. I think this is a good segue, and I really appreciate you coming on, man. As I was saying, I mean, I'm sure you get heaps of these invites, so the fact that you made time for me, it means a lot. But look, before, given we're going to be talking about, I guess, spirituality, the question of religion as it pertains to politics, I'm curious to hear. In that vein, along those lines, I'm sure you've come across folks like John Vervaeke, who has this like really good. It's called Overcoming the Meaning Crisis. I think it was like he did it during COVID, on like the meaning crisis, ostensible meaning crisis. And then there are people like I think Daniel Schmittenberger, if that's how it's pronounced, who talks about like the poly crisis. So TLDR is. These theorists, they analyze that we're kind of in like this unique like meaning crisis for civilization, for humanity, or in particular the West, and they do speak of it in like a spiritual kind of like death of God kind of sense, right? So firstly, do you agree with them that we do live in a very particular kind of meaning crisis that is really idiosyncratic to, let's say, our epoch? And if so, have you been thinking about this through more like your political philosophy angle?
So there's a lot that can be said on that, but for the first thing, I haven't read their work. I haven't read the John Vervaeke meaning crisis. I've heard people talk about the meaning crisis, and I've heard that name be brought up before, but that's not a book I've read, so I can't really speak on what they say exactly. But I think there is an obvious way in which the meaning crisis is that there is a meaning crisis. I actually don't think it's particularly new. It's just that what's new is that we're really talking about the meaning crisis, that we're like acknowledging it. And I think COVID was a crystallization of that for a couple of reasons. Because, when we're starting to talk about the meaning crisis, what that signals is that we're already part on the way out of the meaning. We're on our way out of it, in the sense that there's a kind of change. And I'll elaborate as to what I mean. So there's been a zeitgeist shift for a while. I've called it the conservative zeitgeist, and I say conservative not so much in a political sense, conservative in the sense like traditionalist, a gravitation towards like traditional ideas, traditional values, religion, right, more broadly. And you saw glimpses of this with the rise of New Age spirituality, which I think is a kind of more, for lack of a better term, like schizophrenic sort of.
Which for sure we'll discuss because it's in your essay too. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I think like in COVID there was this phenomenon. A lot of people have called it like mass psychosis. And a good example of this is like you just saw a lot of people get into New Age spirituality, and sometimes that can be fine for a lot of people, but some people got it into a way where they like started believing in like alternate reality basically, and there's various different expressions that this can take. People were like taking astrology super literally, or they were taking like prediction scheme tarot cards. Like there's just a million different ways you can
unbelievable. And also like I think empirically you can view it like they've been done polling and stuff where the decline in the trust in the scientific method, this notion of like, okay, we can do studies and like falsify, because the problem is even if a study comes out, they're like, oh, this has been funded by, I don't know, some elite that controls the world, and so all of this kind of like in like a like destructive skepticism, let's say.
Yeah, and there's that during COVID, because people were just there to sit with the realities and ponder it, and it's the first time they were like there with their thoughts for like an extended period. I think for a lot of people that's a scary thing, and it's why I like to tell philosophers, but we'll come back to this. This is a bookmark, and I thought about this while I was listening. I feel like philosophers are bad at politics and religion, and like they're not supposed to, because they are different things. But like with every like political work, every philosophical work, you often see like the conclusion will involve something to do with like tearing with the negative and tearing with the contradictory and tearing with the ambiguity. And it's like, yeah, that's easy for you to say. That's easy for people with like otium and like philosophical training. Or I would just say, if we're going to be honest, like I think there are natural differences. Some people, their strengths are more like in the verbal area. They're more like existentially intelligent. Some more practically, like there's different kinds of intelligence and abilities people have. I think a lot of people like and you could say this is partially societal, and that we're not encouraged to like think deeply about a lot of stuff. When people are there to sit with their own thoughts, as they did during COVID, I think part of why you got mass psychosis is because like people like don't want to deal with the negative and deal with contradiction. There's hit with like a lot of
the uncertainty.
They just want to escape immediately, and I think part of that is like I don't think there's a part of that I don't think is new, which is like humans are a pattern seeking species fundamentally. Like religion has always been a feature of human society in some way or form, right? And so there's a craving for that. There's absolutely a craving for that. That's no secret. I think spirituality fulfills a component that religion fulfills without a lot of the other components. So it fulfills that kind of like meaning crisis only temporarily, but it doesn't really work, because the thing about spirituality is because spirituality is like a subjective relationship of the person. So it's like other people, if you believe this, for example, like I can say I believe in a mixture of pantheistic ideas, and I think the universe is this way, and like I like to read about Sufism here, Buddhism here, and like this is my reality. Okay, all right, so what? Right. It doesn't really matter in terms of if other people, don't believe that. There's nothing that's going to bring you towards other people. And that's kind of what religion does, is it brings you to other people, right? Like
Yeah,
through
yeah.
binding rituals, religiore. And that's what I think people are craving. And it's not a coincidence that I think that COVID, right? You saw like a rise of New Age spirituality, which is partially downstream of like a trend that like was already happening since the decline of religion more broadly, like Jameson in postmodernism, the late stage, what is it, the latest stage of
Logic
capitalism?
of late stage capitalism, yeah.
Right. He wrote about how in the 80s there was like a huge spike of cults, like massive spike of cults, like and obviously starting like before that, but you see like a direct relationship between decline of religion, rise of cults, right? Well, I think there is more of that, but more recently you see like a rise of interest in stuff like Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity and
The Ortho Bros.
Yeah.
And I actually think Orthodox theology is profound, like Maximus the Confessor. And so I'm not being like cynical about it. I think there's something beautiful there, of course.
Yeah. No, I think there's a genuine interest in it, and I think there's a genuine way in which those things will get very big. But the reason why I think people like to dismiss it is because there's often like a LARPy way that it is sometimes embraced, and that's because like a lot of the people who are embracing it are, which is people who are by themselves like kind of atomized, who are flirting with it, and kind of they just really like want something, and so they're gravitating to it. But I think it's foolish. Like so many of the libs I've seen and leftists who are saying, "Oh, this rise of New Age spirituality is just the rise of Christianity is just a total like fad." There's a couple of reasons I don't think it's a fad, even if it takes on LARPy ways. And the reason it takes on LARPy ways is because the people who are taking it on are not part of a broader ancestral tradition of it. Like it's often kids with like parents who either are not religious or, and I say kids, I'm talking really anyone below like 35. Like, so like it's people with parents who are either not that religious or are like religious in a much more liberal way. So they're not really like connected to the tradition, so that's why it takes on a LARPy way. So like sometimes people will get interested. They're like, I'm Catholic maxing or whatever. It's like they're not actually connected to the tradition in a way, but it doesn't mean that the desire for it isn't genuine. I think there's a genuine desire. And one fascinating phenomenon that I've heard documented, among people in both like Orthodox and Catholic circles, and I saw this myself when I was just like out of interest, kind of just checking out the various interests of various churches in my city about like, a year or 2 years ago, gradually over that period. And I noticed that the Orthodox and Catholic churches had way more young people than the like liberal, Unitarian churches, United churches. The United churches are like the kind of liberal churches. Some jokingly say the gay churches, right? They're in an effort to be more kind of palatable, like those churches, and the Anglican churches can be like this too. They tend to like, and I understand it, like they want to like be more palatable to like people in the modern day, so they kind of will attract people. But I find funny though, it's actually like older people at these churches, and like the people converting at a high rate to like Orthodox and Catholicism are like young people, like Zoomers. So why is that? And I think it's because people are going to that because they're trying to get away from some of that modern like ideology. Like they're trying to get away from that. And the other thing too is like I think there's a real way in which the material conditions have been changing in such a way that kind of like are making like very like austere Christian values make sense. And this is not like in a positive or a negative way. I'm viewing this almost in the kind of like base superstructure way, which is because this is like not necessarily unequivocally good or bad as a phenomenon. In some ways it's good, in many ways it's actually bad because it's rationalizing rather than doing, which is a lot of people are just living kind of somewhat austere lives. So like you think about it, like people just aren't going out, they're not drinking as much. Gen Z is drinking way less, they're having way less sex, they're dating way less. They're just like way more austere. Like everyone's just like focusing on work and all that. And we saw glimpses of this with like, the video you found my channel from, the Burnout Society, this kind of like cut yourself off and just like focus on working hard and don't engage in like hedonism, don't engage with sex and drinking or whatever. There's a way in which like Christianity now kind of makes way more sense when people are already kind of living these lives, right? So I think there's part of that convergence. And this is why I think like people who think like, oh, there's going to be no Christian revival. Well, I actually think there is going to be a Christian revival. It's just like it's going to be a little bit strange. It's going to be a bit strange in how it manifests. I think it's absolutely going to happen because ideologies tend to become big when the material conditions change in such a way. Like the reason you got feminism emerge, for example, largely like in the 70s and 80s, like in terms of like second wave feminism, then third wave feminism in the 90s, was because of the capital's demand for female integration into the workforce.
More labor, yeah,
labor, and also like a service economy in which women are often like better, like literally better to hire for a lot of those service jobs.
Indeed.
So you had like
HR, this kind of jobs, right? Yeah.
Those and like you also have like all these changes where people are becoming more like people are objectively like less in a physiological sense masculine than their generation was before. Like I'm not saying this in terms of necessarily, you can view this as necessarily good or bad or whatever. I think it's bad, but like some people can interpret this as good. But it is a fact that like testosterone rates, sperm count, fertility has been declining. And what kind of ideologies do you have? You have you have a lot of gender dysphoria, and I think it's partially in some ways there's a part of gender dysphoria that's, I think, natural to all phenomenological experience, as you probably know, given you like Lacan and psychoanalysis and stuff. There's a part of dysphoria that's kind of natural to the human condition. But there's also a way in which I think there's a very real sense in which a lot of people like just don't really, like there's a whole cohort of men, for example, that don't really identify with like traditional masculinity because they're just like physiologically different than their grandpa who was. So, this leads to, I think, ideologies, which is like I think part of LGBTQ ideology and gender theory and stuff, where it's like very convenient. It says, okay, well, actually gender has never been this way. It's always been, constructed, or, and that's very different, than the leap to say like sex is also constructed, the whole other rabbit hole. Or, and capital, where has capital play into this? Well, like pharma is what will solve your problems. Okay, well, you can maybe take these blockers, you can do this surgery, you can kind of deal with that. So my point is just to say that there's always a dialectic in which the dominant ideologies fit with conditions. Now, that can be good or bad depending on like, do ideologies make sense for the conditions, or do they merely rationalize what's happening? Like, do they rationalize what's happening in terms of like, are they celebrating decay as progress, or are they trying to make something that's happening into progress? Christianity, I think, in some sense, I'm kind of optimistic to see like the rise of it, but part of me sees it a little bit like, in some ways, I think it's a lot of people out there who are kind of, like volcels or incels or whatever.
Can I pull this thread a little bit?
Like using it to rationalize it, and I can't blame them. So it's not like this is a negative thing, but it's partially why I think the revival of religion is very real. Yeah, but also at the same time, like it's going to be weird. Like it's going to be.
I get what you mean, because I'll say a small thing on the Volcel bit, but also at the same time ask you a question about Christianity, because I think I want to pull the thread, because a big part of the essay is on you trying to kind of articulate or try to formulate like why Christianity perhaps is not like any other ideology. Because like some like really silly way of viewing all of these things, like, oh, everything's like a narrative, everything's just like a meta-narrative. Christianity is the same as like Tech Pro Silicon Valley ideology or AGI. Nah, like I think we need to be a bit more, we need to be a bit more, critical and analyze it a bit more carefully than just saying that in like a lazy way. But the Volcel thing, I was thinking about this too, right? I mean, and now again, I've got a lot of Christian friends. I love them dearly, but sometimes, blokes who can't get laid would end up becoming Christian. I'm like, oh, no sex before marriage. I'm like, cause I think you just can't get laid. Like it's fine, So like you become a Christian because then
yeah,
you have a
that's a
rationalization. Yeah.
And then there's the other phenomenon where it's like, you know, you do it a fair amount and you're totally disenchanted by it and disappointed in it. And you're
Yeah. Like
and it's
the
in some
Russell
ways you're
Brand
like,
types,
oh, well,
right?
it kind of validates the truth of it.
Yeah, and the thing is,
Yeah.
like, as you were saying, I'm not sure if it was in this. Oh yeah, I think it was in your other essay, the Christian case against capitalism. So you know, like the 7 deadly sins and so on. You know, like lust. It's true, right? Like everyone knows, if you have too much of, like, if you're like a sex and porn addict, you're probably 99.9% of the time you're gonna be a depressed, miserable human being. Like there's no question about it. So these aren't like arbitrary just like put in like a book just because but we'd rather have I would even say, yeah, historical, even empirical basis to have these kinds of things like sloth, gluttony, lust, all of these things, right? And so I find it's a really good point you just made there, but there's like the kind of wholesale types, but also people who have like really engaged in like the whole new age hippie psychedelics sex love scene, and they're like, it's kind of like the Chesterton quote, right? Weariness is not when weariness, one becomes, I'm paraphrasing here, you face despair not when you can't get what you want, not when you can't achieve some height, but rather when you do get what you want, and when you achieve the heights and you realize that's the point of despair where you're like, oh, this is not what I wanted. And I think it's very psychoanalytical too, but also this doesn't fulfill me. So I find a lot of people in the new age world, they go into like, yeah, free sex, free love, and then afterwards immediately become like very conservative, like to the point where very like austere even. But all of that, like, religion is used to like justify their lived experience or like their material conditions, and the kind of religion is like an ideology that justifies their current mode of being. And then the other really good point you made was all of this is just what I believe, what I feel. There's no phylogeny, there's no like ancestry, there's no like tradition or history you're connected to as a part of this. So along these lines, Tony, I want to ask you this, and this is something I would really like you to flesh out. Put it in like a very plain way. Why is Christianity for you not like any other ideology? You know, like why would you say that Christianity is not just ideology, as it were?
That's a tough question. That is a tough question. I'll get there. But I would like to add something to that particular.
Oh, go ahead, bro. Yeah, of course. I'm just like, you know.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think it's because it's illuminating. So there's a couple. Well, first, just when you're talking about the people who get engaged in the new age hippie stuff and they get burned out. I mean, there's this old stereotype, and I really think there's a lot of truth to it, which is former players make the most protective fathers. And it's like, why would that be? You know, it's because it's like you kind of you start to see the kind of perverse nature of this, and like how there's a real psychological vulnerabilities at play, you know, and it's like in some sense you'd want to like protect the innocence of your child, you know, and I think there's a kind of a yearning for innocence actually among men and women. They're just expressed in very different ways. It's kind of pretty funny if you look at the way the discourses in the zeitgeist unfold. Like, you know, for men, for example, you know, it's manifested often like, you know, preferring someone who's a bit younger or like low body count, right? Now it's like, why is that, right? Because like there's some people who do that for kind of for gross reasons, and I think there's a real way if you look at like dating app data that, you know, just like there is that objective preference men have. It's pretty startling. And it's like, why? I think like part of it is like, you know, people who have like the older they get, the more likely they're probably socialized into this kind of insane world of this insane dating economy that exists, this terrible culture. So it's like you kind of, you know, you yearn for someone who isn't as like corrupted by it. Now, what's funny is a lot of women yearn for that in men too. And there's this, they often say, you often hear this, like a golden retriever boyfriend. I want a golden retriever boyfriend, or I want a guy like I want to
So like Zoran Mamdani.
Well, I don't know if Zoran is really quite fit to
happy-go-lucky
golden.
fella.
I would
Yeah.
say he more fits the kind of like safe guy, but like the golden retriever boyfriend is often like Keanu Reeves or like a hunk.
See, interesting.
Yeah, a hunk. And what's funny is a hunk used to be a kind of slur for like a hot dumb guy. He's hot, but he's dumb. Now it's actually kind of like a cool thing, like himbo. And I think the reason why women describe it positively is because when they mean by dumb, they don't actually mean stupid. They mean a guy who's a little bit like oblivious of his own attractiveness and power. And that's what the idea of like a golden retriever boyfriend. It's sort of like a kind of person who's just a little bit like, he's just nice. He's not like, he's not like the kind of douchebags or the
like not too full of himself.
Yeah, or just doesn't know how to like, who's not going to abuse their sort of power to like manipulate women and talk to multiple or whatever, which is, what they complain about. They complain about situationships. So there's sort of this interesting like little thing, conservative sentiment in the air when it comes to that. I mean, I've also described in other conversations how I think, in some sense, like there's a Puritanism that on the in a lot of feminist discourse that's surfaced, but it's also like in language that's confusing because they often use words like patriarchy or like talk negatively about men, so it's like men won't listen to it. But there's actually like an underlying conservative sentiment. I mean, the whole idea of like consent discourse and all that is like an attempt to establish some sort of rules, and it's like it's obviously there's obviously problems with that attempt and failures and many critiques of it, but the attempt to establish rules is understandable because we're living in a world where there are no rules. There used to be rules. That's what religion was for. I mean, like, it was like one man, one woman, there's like basic, like, don't cheat with your neighbor's wife, it's like common sense stuff, or some level of like morality, decency, like these are
but also like even shame. I think shame has a good place in society.
Huge. All culture, all civilizations, like except liberal capitalist civilizations have shame. Although I would argue, like, actually capitalist civilizations have shame too, and they have morality too. So when we say they have when we say we live in a moral relativist time, that's only in the sense that we live in a moral relativist time because there's no dominant morality or a structure that supervises morality. So there's no like great Christian denominations that like are more overpowering than like the morality of the market, because what replaces the absence of morality is the morality of the market. And what are people shamed for now? That people are
not being happy
shamed.
enough.
Or not being happy enough, not enjoying yourself enough, not like, or like I'm sure like every guy's experience is like every like guys talk about like sex like kills, or like it's achievements, and it's like a shame if you didn't, you know what I mean? So it's like the kind of opposite of slut shaming is this new shaming. So there's absolutely like new there isn't morality that exists. It's just that it's just like market logic that's replaced, like competitive market logic that's replaced a new morality. So there's all these like ways in which there's zeitgeist sort of shifting. I also think, I mean, also like what is the situationship complaint? When women complain about situationships, I mean, that's just like a transaction gone wrong. One person wants a relationship, the other wants sex. That's literally all it is. Like there would be no ambiguity. It's like, if there wasn't a mixed signal, and that's the problem with an absence of rules. And we're all struggling to establish those rules, right? But people haven't figured out like what they are and how.
Look, I'd also say this, like it is a very subtle point, because I do know friends of mine. Like, I know this friend, she and I were quite close. She's been in an open relationship for 12 years. Like and it's working beautifully for them. Like they're with her and her partner, like because originally from Germany, and it was. So, I mean, what I'm trying to say here is that, like, I don't know, I certainly am not while I completely, concede your point that shame is really important for any society, and even in our liberal capitalist society, we have shame, but it comes in the sense of like, oh, you aren't enjoying enough, you aren't self-actualizing enough, you aren't finding yourself enough, all of this kind of stuff, right? But then at the same time, though, I don't know how to even think of, maybe, perhaps it's because everything leads to a contradiction, but it's like, I do want to maintain that sense of like, what I would just call like really naive kind of freedom where if someone wants to have an open relationship and be like, Polly, go ahead, do your thing. Because look, the truth is there are folks who do it fine. And as you were saying, it doesn't become like a situationship or whatever. That being said, though, and this is probably not a good argument. As far as I know, majority of people aren't gonna do well in an open relationship, like including myself. I mean, I've been in one before. It didn't work out for me well. Like it's just, I think for most of us, just like a plain old traditional monogamous relationship is what works. And the thing though is this, right?
That's generally what social rules and customs are. Like there's a rule and the exception.
And the exception,
like exceptions can exist, but we have to remember that they're exceptions and that there are rules. Kind of the new progressive discourse wants to say that there are no rules, that the rules are relative. But no, exceptions can exist and be tolerated. But one has to, with the breakdown of rules, though, you get the breakdown of order. And, people really, that's what's funny. People figure out a lot of this stuff, but way too late. Like people figure out a lot of this stuff at like very late in life. It's like they tell you, try every apple on the tree, go and experiment, all to like realize what your grandparents did. Like
probably
literally,
works. Yeah,
that's what tends to happen. It's like.
Yeah, it's so funny you say that, Tony. I mean, because I say you very much argue this, like you call it the rationality of religion, as like the sense of social function, where there's like an immanent rationality in how it structures. I would even put it this way. I would use kind of like cog-sci terms. Like it's like a socio-cultural cognitive infrastructure. It provides you. I mean, I can get into like inactive cognitive science and all of that, but I do believe deeply that religion just provide like a way for us to have a social infrastructure for our subjectivity. But then what I find interesting, I was going to get to a point on what you were saying about the polyamorous.
I bookmarked your question, by the way, about why is Christianity the best religion, but that's, I think, a whole other like thing. We'll bookmark that to set, because I feel like that's like, why is Christianity the best religion? I think we have to establish like why religion is good, because if you think about like a lot of liberal, like modern, progressive type minded people, it's hard, like for them, the average atheist isn't like particularly against Christianity. They just think like religion is stupid, right?
Indeed, like in itself, sort of, Yeah, but I guess for me, I wasn't even trying to ask you why Christianity is the best religion. It's the religion that I'm drawn to most, probably because it's the religion I'm familiar with.
Religion, but that's a whole other thing.
Actually, but for me, it's more like why. Because let's put it this way, right? Let's say like we have like a bricolage of ideologies. We have the capitalist ideology, the AGI, or whatever, right? Islam, Christianity, Judaism, or Buddhism, Western Buddhism, or all of this, right? But like, I am curious as to like, if you were to make like an apologia for why you probably should take Christianity a bit more seriously, than just treating it as just another worldview or just another ideology, how you would perhaps make that argument.
So you want to go on that first, or you want to go on the thing before, like first?
No, the thing before I lost my train of thought, because I was going to ask you a related question to the notion of like, how do we maintain this sense of like the exceptions can exist, but with some rules. But I think it's more important to kind of get, because what I find most interesting about is where you speak of the rationality of religion. That's kind of what really drew me towards the piece, right? But then I wasn't expecting you to say where you do believe. I don't think in the article you even say this, that Christianity is the best religion. That's quite interesting. So I would like to hear more about that.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. So the material, that's the thing. We need to establish the importance of religion before we get into like why Christianity is a better religion. Because it's like, these are, I'm always aware, like when making these arguments, there's a lot of qualifiers that need to be made, because these are quite like, heretical claims in progressive circles, to one, claim that about the rationality of religion, or the, I call it them in two different ways. Yeah, I talk about the rationality of religion in that one piece, and then the Christian socialism when I say the material reality of morality, which These are direct response to like Marxists and kind of like, people who believe that morality is just some kind of like abstraction that is divorced from the real world. And they say, okay, well, this is moralism. It's just moralism. What about materialism? I mean, there's morals. Morals do matter if they actually cohere with material reality and if they produce effects in reality. So that does matter. Like, I mean, if you want to know the gateway to like a lot of this in my thinking, in some ways, you remember the Dune video, the one on Ibn Khaldun?
Yes, I do.
So
the essay on one dime, yeah.
Yeah, that video I did where I explained the ideas of Ibn Khaldun, this 14th century Islamic thinker. He's in many ways the first sociologist, is often claimed, like kind of like you could say Islamic Max Weber or even Karl Marx, minus the communist part. And I try to explain his ideas through this video on Dune. I use Dune to explain his ideas. And look, so like that video was based on an essay I wrote, which was a Straussian interpretation of the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun. It was way back in grad school. So like I kind of repurposed that work. And what always fascinated me about Ibn Khaldun is he's a guy living in the Islamic Golden Age, and he's making essentially very rational arguments for religion without an appeal to like, the matter of fact, like just like so like religion, part of its function is a guarantor of knowledge. It functions to like say, why is something true? Well, it comes from a holy book. It comes from God. This is like, there's a gravitas to it. There's an objectivity to it. But what's interesting about Ibn Khaldun, in a similar way to like what would come many centuries later with sociologists like Emil Durkheim or Weber, or people who talk about the rational aspect of religion, is he made his arguments solely on materialist grounds for the most part. He didn't say like, oh, it's true because Allah said it's true. He was talking about just the way societies work and the fact that you need rules, codes of conduct, and for example, like basic stuff. Like, it's funny, the biggest proof of the rationality of religion is the fact that so much self-help advice, so much philosophical discourse, so much like secular discourse just ends up literally giving people advice that like ancient texts have been saying for so long. Like
a good example is 12 Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. It's he keeps pulling from the Bible all the time. I'm like, why not just read the Bible instead? Because this guy is just putting it in like modern self-help jargon, what all of these texts said in the past. Yeah.
Oh, and Jordan Peterson is super significant in the zeitgeist because, for all his problems, for me, my problems with Jordan Peterson always had to do with the way he talks about philosophy and like politics. I think he just doesn't understand what he's talking about with a lot of political issues. And like, when he talks about like Marxism or the Frankfurt School, he's completely out of his depth. But as a figure, like, so I never took really that big of an issue with his self-help stuff.
Of course.
For the most part, it's really standard stuff. But he's an important figure in the zeitgeist because he is sort of like a representation of secular-minded people getting into religion. And I saw this firsthand when, back in about 2015, it was before really his big scandals. I went to Jordan Peterson show, and it was with a bunch of my friends. One of them in particular was very, very into Peterson. Like he was more than I. For me, I was like kind of like I liked some things and I didn't like everything. But I noticed that we are the youngest folks in the audience. It was mostly like, Xers, it was like an older millennials, but mostly Gen Xers. And we even ran into like, some of my former high school teachers, the three of them in particular. And one of them literally said like Peterson helped him to rediscover his faith. That's interesting. I didn't like think about it that deeply at the time, but I look back on that. Peterson represented, in a, sort of like Zizek had made this observation way back too when he called him a Christian atheist, right? And atheist not in the sense of like whether or not like God exists. Atheist in the sense that for all practical matters, God is not shaping like what is on earth. There's no like divine intervention. There's no like forget the miracles and all that stuff. Like the practical truth of religious doctrine, like what is that? And Peterson in many ways is literally just like pushing that. And the fact that that's become more mainstreamed does suggest a shift. And it's also like interestingly, like kind of not that at odds with a lot of the Enlightenment project. People tend to imagine the Enlightenment project as like dramatically like opposed to religion. It was not actually. It was opposed to, definite authority. It was opposed to kind of like revelation or like irrationalism. But all of the great Enlightenment thinkers all loved Christianity. Like Kant loved Christianity in many ways. He was trying to create a secular framework based on Christianity of morality, right? You had like even Hume was like, even Hume appreciated Christianity.
So and Hegel. I mean, Todd McGavin argues
that position on it, right?
Yeah, because I think Todd McGavin argues that Hegel's whole notion of the concept was pretty much, he was trying to create the idea of the concept around the Christian notion of love. So there's no question about it. I promise this will be the only interruption. In the past few years, I truly have cherished connecting with all you listeners of this podcast, whether through email, video calls, or simply the comments. And I'd hate to lose this fledgling community we've built around our shared love for philosophy and science, and so I'm kindly asking you to consider subscribing to this podcast on Substack. Let's cut the BS. In our techno-feudalist times, no platform is perfect, and at the end of the day, these companies own us. However, if I may naively be hopeful, Substack at least allows me to export email addresses for me to keep connected with you all if one of these platforms decides to kick me off for some reason, which, as we're well aware, they've done in the past with no explanation. In fact, this almost happened to me recently. So please, let's stay connected through Substack, and if all else fails, at least the good old SMT protocol. That is a nerdy joke for you programmers out there.
And I was going to say the Founding Fathers. So the Founding Fathers were all, they usually get, some of them are a little different, like Ben Franklin's a little bit different, but like the founders are usually described as deists, which is basically like you believe a God exists, but he's not.
That's interesting you say that. Yeah.
They're not shaping the world as we say, which is in many ways close to the Christian atheist position in the sense that the Christian atheist position is like sees the value of Christianity, but doesn't think like they think God essentially died on the cross, right? When Jesus died, right? Like that meant the death of God on earth. And that's how they interpret the significance of that event. For the founders, they might say like, well, they might still believe in God in the sense as even a guarantor of knowledge, but they don't believe in they didn't believe in miracles. So that's why they were like so promoting Christianity, but were against like over centralized authority. And they were also like against the kind of literalism that would end up getting very popular with the second Great Awakenings, which was after the founders, it's a complicated issue. It opens up a can of worms because let's just say what the people on the ground in America were starting to believe religiously was a little bit different from what the founders believed. But in any case, they saw the value of Christianity, and Jefferson even tried to create a different Bible where it was like
without miracles,
without all the miracles, yeah. So it's like the Enlightenment project's not opposed to Christianity. That really the opposition to all religion comes really in the French Revolution due to their particular circumstances with the kind of Catholic Church and Jacobinism, and then Jacobinism influences Bolshevism. This is a hot take, but I think Bolshevism is more Jacobinist than it is Marxist. But it takes these kind of ideas of wanting to essentially forcefully transform society from the top down through enlightening the people. And it all stems from Rousseau. Many people have pointed this out on Rousseau is one of the interesting thinkers of the Enlightenment because unlike the other thinkers of the Enlightenment, he's usually juxtaposed to Locke and Hobbes. Rousseau is like he believes people must be forced to be free. They might have to be forced to be free. It's kind of like the radical hard left view. And I think that is kind of like where the hostility to religion comes from. A lot of it kind of is based in this belief that okay, well, there's some people who don't need it anymore and who are more enlightened, and we want to make people not need it.
Yeah, I would say that's a very naive take, isn't it? This is the Richard Dawkins kind of, you need to transcend your religiosity and all of this.
Well, even he's kind of a little bit moved in a
cultural Christian,
subtle way. He's like, I'm a cultural. Oh, he says he's like a cultural Christian. Then he's trying to say he always said that, which is not entirely accurate. Like,
Yeah, I mean,
there's a subtle shift.
Last, in one of his pieces, he mentioned that, yeah, even like 10, 15 years ago, at the height of New Atheism, Dawkins was still talking about this cultural Christian stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah, but the thing is, the interesting thing is, there is like this really interesting. I find Dawkins and Peterson very much in the same camp. Like, I think this whole cultural Christian stuff is interesting, which is why for me, I still take more of a perhaps a. Are you familiar with Peter Rawlins's work in Power of Theology?
I've I saw this on the questions. In Peter Rollins, I have not dived into his work, but he's been recommended to me by so many people, and I did, like, in Cadell's. Yeah, Cadell last, you mentioned Cadell last. I'm actually going to be in a anthology with him called, I think it's called Red Cross, but it's kind of like Christian themed, Christian socialist philosophy themed. And he did a course on Christian atheism in which Peter Rollins had a guest lecture. And
yeah, he's great. Rollins is fantastic.
I've checked out like one or two of his lectures and interviews, and I know he's one of the thinkers that, like, once I engage with him deeply, like, it's going to be a whole rabbit hole, and it's going to be very interesting. And I'm like, I have too many things going on, so I haven't done that. Like, I kind of like,
nah, fair enough, man.
There's a lot of people I know, like, this is going to be pretty significant period of an arc for me. It's going to be an arc. So I kind of almost bookmark a lot of arcs because I have to get through my current ones. But so I don't really want to. I wouldn't have much to say on Peter Rollins specifically, but I do know he's associated with the Christian atheist sort of camp more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I brought him up was because, and I have got a question for you on this too, because so let me pull in a few threads from what we discussed so far. We kind of spoke of the rationality of religion, kind of gave it a bit of a logic, talking about it being kind of like this socio-cognitive infrastructure. And then we kind of obviously laid out the critique of kind of the New Age stuff. And at the same time, also, there's people falling into orthobros, the Lapi version of, finding a new religion without the phylogeny or the history. Now comes, I was reading your piece and I was kind of like, oh man, I'm really curious to hear what if Kierkegaard were to read your piece, he would be like, oh my God, this guy, he is becoming almost like this pragmatic view of religion, right? It's good for social function. And in fact, this was a lot of his critiques of Christendom in Europe when he was writing his his letters, right? And the thing, though, is what I find interesting, and here for me is why I would still say I'm some kind of a Christian. For me, an ontological fundamental state of human existence is this notion of alienation, this notion of what you might call the split subject in psychoanalytic terms. And I find Kierkegaard, he is in many ways the quintessential Protestant, right? Ultimately, it's just your relationship with God, especially in Fear and Trembling, he writes of this. But I think even more than all of that, what he really writes about, and I'm in no way a Kierkegaard scholar, is despair, is alienation in a very existentialist sense, right? And I think even Peter, who's recently been doing some great live streams on Kierkegaard, he speaks a lot about this notion of, the Christian message is the death of God. So what you would call apathetic theology, negative theology, right? And the fact that the alienation, the kind of despair you feel within, ultimately you see that in the absolute, the big other, God too. And in that you find this sense of, I don't know what the term is, almost that's where salvation lies. It's not saying, oh, God is going to give me the answer, but in finding this connection with the alienation of being as such, there's some kind of salvation. And I'm more drawn to that because as far as I know, no other, to put it in a very formulaic sense, symbolic, a system of narratives, let's say, really captures this notion of individual human alienation the way Christianity does. For me, again, that line, Ella, Ella, lama sabachthani, is probably one of the most powerful lines in all of religion in human history, where, Christ cries out to the Father, 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 why have thou forsaken me? So, okay, having said all of that, I mean, yeah, like, since we are talking about, in some sense, an apologia, a defense of Christianity, what would your kind of, I guess, attack me here would be to those folks like the Protestant types who kind of say that, oh, no, you shouldn't, like, Christianity is above all, it's about, like, your individual relationship with God, it's about, like, love, it's not about, like, morality or social function or any of these things. All those things come second. Like, I know that's a that's not like a common take in the history of Christianity. I think it's a very modern take, to be honest. But how would you kind of respond to that kind of, that line of thought, if first of all, if I was clear in what I was saying?
Oh yes, you know I'm a Catholic, right?
Oh, I didn't know that. No, I didn't know you were a Catholic. Yeah.
So
I knew you were a Christian, but I didn't know you were a Catholic. Yeah.
Yeah, but I didn't really like embrace the actual doctrine of Catholicism particularly till very recently. And I mean, even then, it's like it's like our views are always changing. But it's been more recently where I've because as I've gotten in the last like really 4 years, kind of more serious about Christianity, because I technically went to Catholic school, but none of my friends were really religious. In Ontario, it's a very particular thing where like the public schools are Catholic, but like non-Catholics can go. It's not, and I was actually quite strictly atheist when I was younger, so I didn't really see a value of religion until like pretty gradually, maybe. I mean, and it starts the route that a lot of people go into, which is like you start getting into religion and you do the thing that all like intellectual airheads do, which is like they get into like every Eastern religion except the Western religions because they leftist brained, like, so they're like, or actually even right-wing people do this too. They're like, they get really into like Buddhism, very classic, and they I even took a whole like Eastern spirituality course, and it's funny, it was called Eastern spirituality. They didn't want to call it Eastern religion.
That's a good point. Yeah,
they don't know where to put like Taoism. Taoism is like Eastern religion is interesting because I actually like,
but like in Buddhism, one big part of Buddhist theology is the Sangha, which is the community, which is pretty much religion, the social function of Buddhism.
Yeah, it wasn't, but the Catholic part. So like to speed forward, after embracing Christianity, and I went through like I really seriously, because this is not how most people engage with religion. I don't think they should be expected to, which is why we should remember like to always, when we're talking about the social power of religion, we should remember that there's a big difference between like philosophical minded people and like most people engage with religion. It's going to be qualitatively different. But for me personally, like most people don't have the luxury or otium to like, go church shopping. Like it's just not, they just don't really treat religion that way. But, I was trying to like really look and study every denomination to see like, what do I, agree with most. And, it's funny, like I was going through the Protestant views and like, namely like Calvinism and Lutheranism. And it's funny about Calvinism is like there's a lot of stuff I like on it, and also like some of the most insane bullshit in it that I think was like taken on steroids in evangelism, like predestination and stuff like that. Like these are the kind of things that I think I detest most. But what's interesting in like the Catholic traditions and the Orthodox tradition, that's not like the thing that's really emphasized. What I've noticed about the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, which I think are far more like each other than a lot of the Protestant ones, there's some pretty significant differences. But in terms of and I would say actually the differences is big thing is political. But and I like to be very careful when I talk about denomination, because this is the kind of thing where it's like I could, there'll be many disagreements there. But one thing that I do notice, there's a real practical component to like Orthodox and Christian and Catholicism, which is really, it's like, what are you doing here on earth? Like, in Orthodox, they focus so much on like, how do you become holy, right? Theosis. And that's like a real thing. It's not like, oh, you pray and you like hope Jesus, you have a good relation. That's why I kind of detest the whole idea of Christianity being just religion, period, being just your relationship with God. I think that it's like spirituality. But the religion is the social component. What are you doing with other people here on earth? Like the binding function, the rituals. And like the process of being holy is not about like whether you believe more in Jesus. Like that's why the evangelicals, you know, when people convert, a lot of people convert to evangelism. It's funny, you see a lot of rich people convert to evangelism, and they just use it to justify their existence. Like, you know, Kanye, you know, he like converts. I mean, I say Kanye's a weird example, but I mean, you've seen this like with Russell Brand. There's older cases of this. Just like watch like Joel Osteen, like a talk on YouTube, you'll see it's like almost just, it's kind of like tons of copium. It's all about like just like believe and manifesting, and it's really like in many ways like a kind of new age Christianity. In terms of like it's like this belief. Whereas what is like, you know, the Orthodox and Catholic traditions, it's doing. It's like, you want to become more holy. How? Well, you have to like give up like a big part of things you enjoy in life during this period of the year. Oh, you have to go to church at this time. You know, it's like when you have to engage in like charity works, you have to engage in. I mean, it's like, and it's like you don't have to, of course, because that would also defeat the point. The whole point of is will. It's not predestination. The whole point is, you know, there's a belief in free will in Christianity, which I think is very important. Very important is this belief in will. And, you know, this importance of here on earth is, you know, it's not just, I think, important in terms of like whether I agree with it, because I agree more with Catholic and Orthodox. Where I tend to prefer Catholicism is actually, and the thing people hate Catholicism for most, and what I originally was most critical of it, which is the existence of the church. So
I'll hope that. That's a good move. It's a good like provocation, you know? Yeah.
I'll just go and articulate that now, actually, because like that.
Please do, bro.
I can't just throw that in, right? Like that's a pretty big claim, probably one I've never made publicly, honestly.
Good,
so,
great.
Yeah, I've never made that publicly.
Because I know Catholics who say, I'm a Catholic, but I hate the church. So I would love to hear what you...
Yeah, I feel like that defeats the point, right? Like, that kind of... Like, at that point, why even... I mean, like you and me, the thing people really miss the infallibility of the church thing. Like, they think that infallibility of the church means they're infallible on all matters. No, they're supposed to be infallible at the level of doctrine. So in terms of the interpretation of doctrine, they're infallible. In terms of like the way they interpret, you know, like the Bible, for example, or just like what is the correct reading of this. That they're infallible on that, and that their word is that. Like this is and the Pope's voice is supposed to be that of the church itself. So like that is supposed to be infallible. Are they infallible in terms of can they make political mistakes? Absolutely. Like, you know what I mean? Are they not? Are they infallible? Absolutely not. Right? Like, you know, there's a reason why, like, within the church, there's so much debate. Within Catholic theologians, there's a lot of debate, and you know, it's not like you can't like question you can't question the church. But it's a different thing to say, oh, I'm a Catholic, but I think the Pope is wrong about this theological matter.
Yeah, totally. I don't want to break your line of thought. However, while you're answering the defense of the church, I'd also like for you to just kind of touch on your thoughts on the new Pope too, please.
Yeah, I'll get there. I mean, I've never been more proud to be a Catholic, man. Like with the new Pope, and the last one was Francis was great too. You know, really, Pope Leo's fantastic.
He was a cutie. Yeah, he was a cutie. The last Pope, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing about like people really like. Then they think it's just a matter of whether it's the Pope himself. I mean, really, like a lot of this is just Catholic social teaching. It's pretty consistent with it. The reason why I think people view it as new is because people aren't used to like they have an image of the history of like the church taking certain sides in political conflicts that seem like viewed through an ideological lens, like right wing, right? So like when they see the Pope is like more like left wing, they're like, oh, I like the Pope now. That's how like a lot of left wing people view it. But you know, Catholicism isn't like left or right. And I would say Christianity more broadly isn't left or right. Yeah, you know, definitely like viewed through a lens. I think undoubtedly Christianity is very socialistic. Like that's obvious. It's certainly not capitalistic, but also it's very incompatible with like a doctrine of Marxist communism. And you know, like part of what people like to view the church negatively because, you know, in recent years, you know, in the 20th century, because, you know, they, like, for example, like they sided with Franco against, you know, the radical left. But what, you know, is kind of important to remember is that the radical left literally wanted to destroyed the church in a very literal sense. Like they wanted to erase the existence of, like they didn't want the Catholic Church to have a presence in Spain, and they literally burned down churches. So I mean, like what do you expect them to really do, right? It's like, maybe we should learn next time. Like don't, like it's kind of not exactly like a position you can compromise on. Like
just at a pure practical level, it seems like a stupid thing to like burn down the whole church.
Right.
Like if you want to make some progress.
Yeah. And then, but there's definitely problems with the Catholic Church. Like, I mean, the church, if it wasn't for the Catholic Church becoming a kind of overstepping its boundary, right? Which is, prior to the Protestant Reformation, it was an economic institution. It was like a class, the clerical class. And that's not really the case of what they're supposed to be, even in Christian doctrine. Like, there's not supposed to be, like, there's nowhere in the Bible that says, like you have to have a clerical class that like extracts taxes from the population and it's like, just like living off of, you can pay people to pay for confessions, and rich people can confess or, pay for like, to be exonerated for their sins or whatever. It's ridiculous. I mean, that's kind of what produced the Protestant Reformation, which you could, debate as to whether it's an overcorrection, but it didn't come out of nowhere. Let's just say that. And it had its purpose and its progressive role. Like for a long time, I kind of identified more, ideologically, principally with Protestantism for part of this like reason, in the sense that it's directly connected to the, Enlightenment and the liberal democratic project. But, that's a historical question. If we're talking about like now, the recent essay I dropped called The Genealogy of Wokeism, Part 2, the evangelist origins of wokeism, is connected to this broader topic we're talking about. If I'm sure if you read it, you might have noticed that like I talk about the ways in which I connect wokeism to the belief obsession with like belief as the most important thing with evangelicalism. You could say it stems from Protestantism more broadly, but evangelism is just more literalist about it. And it manifests in the way that the different denominations approach some of the biggest issues in our time right now, like the climate change. How do evangelicals treat it? It's part of God's plan that this is moving us closer to the apocalypse and that the apocalypse is good. Whereas, how does the Catholic Church view it? No, climate change is objectively a problem. We need to intervene on it. Admitting that you need to intervene on it is an admission that this is not part of God's plan. Why would God do this? It is an admission that God is not like literally, orchestrating everything here on earth. Like the position of Catholicism tends to be like not that like God is, it's not like the Christian atheist position or even necessarily the deist position, which is God is not involved at all, but like God is involved, but in mysterious ways. But for the most part, it's, kind of more like God's watching us rather than God's plan, right? That's more like the view. And we'll get back to it. The God's watching us thing is also a very powerful function, which is that big other function. And I actually think, contrary to the Christian atheist, it's not something we can kind of get rid of. But like, or Israel, the evangelists see like they take a literalist view of the Old Testament and say
the
like
second coming of Christ and all of that.
Exactly. Yeah, they say those.
It's a very cynical view if you think about it, right? It's a very cynical view and almost like treating Jewish people as like a resource.
No, but I think they believe it. That's the thing about like there's a difference between the kind of Israelis. They're a whole different thing. The Israel is founded by atheists, people who explicitly, like Ben Gurion, said that they were practicing biblical atheism is what they were going to structure the state around. But that's a whole other can of worms. Judaism is a whole can of worms. I'm still kind of like exploring a little bit, like just like I like to learn about every religion just for sociological reasons, right? But with on that point of why I even brought up Israel, right? There's a lot of like evangelicals like literally believe like I don't think like people like Ted Cruz or someone like Mike Huckabee, if you've seen their interviews with Tucker Carlson, like these evangelical right wingers, like I don't think they don't believe in their bullshit. Like I think they really literally read the Old Testament.
Oh, absolutely.
And they think that like those who bless the Jews, well that's like the only way to heaven is essentially like you need to restore the homeland of Israel, and that like the people who are on the correct side will go to heaven, right? And when they have the second coming, and that you need Israel, you need Jerusalem in the Jews' hands for the second coming to happen. There's this literalism, right, where it's like, the Catholic Church does not take that position on Zionism at all. It's like for the Church, and this is the case with the Orthodox too. Like the fulfillment of Israel is supposed to be the Church itself. It's not supposed to be like a Jewish ethno-state, right? So there's, obviously, like, so why do I defend the Church? Okay. Because in paper, like, why can't we just come to these conclusions without the Church? Why have this centralized authority? My point, sort of in that genealogy essay, and why I brought it up, is because there is a direct link between the democratization of authority and literalism and fanaticism. Because what happens is that when you don't have a kind of clerical class or a specialized class with authority over truth, who can essentially gatekeep how a doctrine is interpreted, a low barrier for entry as to who has the most credible interpretations of things, well, then anyone can really interpret the faith, and that's what Protestantism opened by saying that it's really about the individual's engagement with the text. It's the text supremacy of the text above all else. So then you can get like a few good denominations come from that. You can get like very interesting things come from that, a lot of progressive developments, but you also like open the door to like really wild readings of Christianity, and also like various Protestantism isn't a thing, right? There's just like a gazillion different sects. There's, like Mormonism. There's so many different tendencies, and that's what it opens the door to, this splintering. Whereas like to actually preserve doctrine, it sometimes does require, in many ways, like people who make it their life's calling to interpret it. And that's the idea of like the Church, right? Like the Pope's merely the head of the Church, and the Church has internal like democracy within it, right? The Catholic Church has internal democracy within it. In many ways, it's kind of like vanguardism for Catholics, and it's in a certain sense, right? I would say it's even more democratic than vanguardism, but that's too hard to explain right now. You have this essentially like attempt to preserve doctrine and also like really flesh it out. So it's not like when you preserve doctrine, it doesn't mean that it fossilizes it. Clearly the Catholic Church has evolved on so many matters, and like they debate AI, for instance. Like AI is a big topic like within Catholic debates right now. They take that.
The
very
new
seriously.
Pope is fantastic on the AI stuff. He's been tweeting about he sounds like Baudrillard.
But there's also a realism, right? Because like if they were totally like fanatics, they would be like, okay, let's just like let's just be completely against this. But they're not. This is the thing. These are like intellectuals, right? They're theology, and they're realists. They understand that like technology is a fact of earthly matters in this world. Like you have to work with it. It's just a matter of what is the most ethical way to work with it. You can't just be openly against it or uncritically for it, right?
Mate, like honestly, if you want to read people, for me, because I'm obsessed with philosophy. It's a sickness I have. It's just like I don't see any other way to do really good philosophy other than going through some of the Catholic philosophy and the Catholic theology. Like my gosh, like so much of some of the most original human thought came from the Church Fathers, and in this case, both the Catholic and even the Orthodox, right? And I can see what you're saying here, because it's sort of like, look, I'll put it this way, right? From one thing I kind of gained from reading your piece, but also what you were saying, was this notion of, so I'll try to be very succinct here. When I talk to you now, because we're talking a bit more philosophically, I do identify as a Christian, because that's what I believe in my heart. However, most people I talk to, if they do ask like what my religious beliefs are, which is rare, people don't care about that kind of stuff, I say I'm an atheist, so I say I'm agnostic. The reason is because as you...
Agnostic, that's probably the most common one, I would say, in like cities especially.
Yeah, there you go, right? And I think the reason I say that is because you're right, like belief is fundamentally embodied. It's a social action. Like I think at the end of the day, what you believe in your heart, all of these things, which is a very Protestant thing, I know, I'm sure that matters, but it's not all that is to it. It's not the be all end all. Whereas with Protestantism, it is the be all end all, like this one individual belief. And I do think, in fact, when I kind of the phenomenology of Christianity for me is very much a social thing, right? Like, I see people going to church, I see people partaking in all these like Christian holidays, Christian rituals. Now, for me, okay, I culturally partake in whatever, Easter, Christmas, all of that, but I don't have like the tradition and the practice of going to church on Sundays. I go when I feel like it sometimes, and I say that in kind of, I'm kind of ashamed of it. It's kind of embarrassing because it's kind of like, oh, it's almost like going to the gym, you know? It's just something I do if I feel like it. It's not something that's like a ritual, a part of my life that structures my subjectivity per se. Which is why, I don't know, I'm kind of like yourself. I'm kind of going on an arc too. I too struggle quite a lot because like in all of my being, I am deeply theologically attracted to Protestantism, but existentially attracted to Catholicism and more of having kind of that structure.
I think it's, if I were to guess, infer, it's likely just because you're a philosophical type, you know.
Probably one of those.
Which is
I got the tism,
you know,
bro.
there's like, there's, you know, the philosophical type or the teacher type. There's a certain archetype. Like I really think there's fundamental dispositions. And there's some people who almost their jouissance in life is actually doubt, is questioning. And
Precisely.
I think people like us are like that. I think
Well
a lot of people aren't like that, and we can't expect them to be like that. Which is why I don't think, you know, for example, if I was to say, why don't we just have like an open-minded view of everything, you know, like you can take this in different ways. You can take like the perennialists. I don't want to get into perennialism. That's a whole can of worms. But like, there's what I believe, yeah, and what like we might believe as individuals as like the truth, and there's what is better for most people. And I think better for most people is where it's political, because political involves the polity, the polis, the community. So when we're talking about what is political, it's what is for others, right? And that's like almost a separate question. So that's why like I separate philosophy and politics a lot as like different registers. So, you know, like there's like, what do you view as like what makes sense in theory, and then there's what makes sense as like for more people. To continue the thing about like the democratization link with literalism and fanaticism is that, you know, on paper, right, it sounds fair to want to like not have this centralized church. Why should anyone have all that authority? Why not we just have everything be, you know, individuals interpret it and democratic? We can have a discussion, an open discussion. The thing about like open discussions aren't open discussions like in this philosophical sense. They're just open battlefields in which people with the most charisma, power, and like networking and like all kind of, there's all kind of factors that go into like what ideas dominate, you know. So it's like, it's not like that's how it's going to play out. It's not going to, you know, when you have like now an open, you know, essentially like what you got after the Catholic, you know, the Protestant Reformation in like countries like Netherlands and England and, you know, especially eventually later British North America is, I mean, like really like kind of a power vacuum. So you had like all these different tendencies prop up. And eventually, like those can turn into very different things. And, you know, it's not a coincidence that like some of the more fanatic Christians are the Protestant ones. And, you know, what's funny is there's almost like the exact same thing with Islam. Now, I'll be more careful talking about this because like that is less my wheelhouse. Even Christian theology is less my wheelhouse. And I must say, part of one of the many reasons why I came to respect the Catholic tradition and its reverence for the church authority is upon, you know, the more I got into theological debates and, you know, really exploring like Catholic theology, the more I realized like how, you know, like amateur I am in this field. Which made it ever more clear that like, oh yeah, there's a reason for this hierarchy. Like, there's a reason why there's an initiation. Like this is not just something that you can casually do. And sure, like there can be like free thinkers, philosophers who on their own time might read a lot of this, like, like Peter Rollins are at a more amateur level, like people like us, right? Or, Zizek. But like, the point is that there's a pretty high barrier to entry to like understand theology, which is why there's this church thing. So like when I want to say even now, I'm like somewhat like even reluctant to talk on theological matters, just because it's like, I don't feel as confident on that as I do on like something like modern monetary theory, for instance. But still, from what I do know, right, from the just it's express, I guess, the journey. And something I did look into is, the democratization of authority is one of those things that like sounds great in theory, but in practice isn't always good. Islam had a similar consequence of this. People like kind of forget that like if you look at like the most fanatical strains of Islam, which emerged more recently, in modern history, like Wahhabism and Salafism, which is many considered often the kind of predecessor to it. Salafism, they emerge as essentially like deeply anti-clerical strains of Islam, very hostile to clerical authority. That's why they're the most hostile to Shia, which has a high reverence for authority, but even Sunni has its own authority structure. They have the muftis. They are very. They have. There's an anti-clerical strain in Wahhabism and Salafism, and it's what was the thing that is positioned as like what is the most important thing is the text itself. So they take a more literalist reading of the text, and you can't go against the text. Like it's not. They're deeply more hostile to like heresy, what they see as heresy anyway, and that interpretation isn't like as like pragmatic, like to interpret, let's say Islam for the modern day. No, it's more literalist. Like we have to stick to the original doctrines and whatnot. And let's just say, like that's another example. Like democratization. Like it's like. Yeah, you'd think that the like extremist wings of Islam would be more authoritarian. Well, in a literal sense, in terms of concentration of authority, well, no. But that's the paradox of when you break down the central authority. You just get often like a bunch of demagogues, a bunch of mini authoritarians who all
without a doubt,
like total truth. So that's always a risk we have to remember when it comes to doctrine. And like the other big thing, and this is why I still say, okay, because you could say, well, Orthodox do that too, right? And I think that's why like Orthodox and the Catholic traditions have such great respect for each other. I think like, there's always like it's tons of memes, like Catholics and Orthodox shaking hands, and it's like, but they like kind of have beef with Protestants. Well, they both have like a respect for at least some level of like hierarchical, like clerical structure, and like, that the people who made this their vocation, they know what they're talking about more than just like us.
Well, look, and on the point, right? I mean, here's where that's a really good point about the fact that you connected Islam into this too. It's just, which is why for me, I've never from early on, I've never been a fan of like anarchism, like leftist anarchism, the Noam Chomsky types. I just like that is such a naive. I mean, how can you be such a I don't know, well-read intellectual, but not understand the drawbacks of anarchism and all of these things that you rightly point out, just like, and again, I know that's a whole other can of worms, but there is this problem with like,
it's a good point though,
with how it kind of the kind of diversity itself moves to like this like fanatical kind of what's the term you used before to describe like factionalism, and where he opens up all these factions and then it creates like a bit of chaos. Tony, I want to be cognizant
literalism
of our time here. And literalism.
Because it's like, it's the whole idea of like interpreting something beyond face value is a philosophical act. And if people,
the kind of the hermeneutic kind of,
like, not everyone can do philosophy. So if everyone's interpreting the text, you're just going to get more literalists. Like, of course, and I mean, like, okay, so you mentioned that a really interesting point there when you said like Chomsky, how could such an intellectual believe in like an idea of anarchism? Well, what I find interesting is that it's almost only intellectuals these days who believe in stuff like anarchism. And I think that's not actually like a coincidence.
Probably, yeah.
It's connected to my broader critique actually of Christian atheism, which is, I have respect for, I engage with like the Christian atheists, and I kind of, in many ways, was pipelined me back into like theology, the big part of it. But the thing about like Christian atheism, right? The position of people like Zizek, or this, what I I'm careful about, like I'll say about Peter Rollins, but I infer is like, essentially they want like Christianity without the guarantor of knowledge, without the certainty, without, the big other and all that. Thing about that is, like, I feel like this is all symptomatic of what I'll call the, this will be a future piece I plan on writing. It'll either be titled The Philosopher's Blindness or The Philosopher's Privilege, or The Intellectual's Privilege, which is, like, okay, why does Chomsky, how could he believe in something like that? How could people believe in this? Well, because, like, they're thinking from their standpoint, like, I am able to interpret this. I have, like, it's obviously not that simple. Why do I have to follow a religion? I can just interpret this and I can arrive at the same ideas. Yeah, that's you. That is not everyone else. Not everyone else is an intellectual. Not everyone else, and it's like for the reasons of ability, time, OTM, privilege, interest,
and material
simple
circumstances.
interest. Like, what I think the biggest thing, it's not even because people think I'm always making an elitist claim if I say this, right? Like, not everyone can be philosophers. Not everyone can interpret things deeply. It's not even like an IQ thing, right? It's literally like an interest thing. Not everyone gets jouissance this way. And I think if we're being honest, a lot of us who are into this stuff, our jouissance is tied to this. It's not even just like we're particularly like super high intelligence. Like we're also like, this is the way in which our enjoyment is, we're getting enjoyment from this. And as a result, it allows us to engage so deeply and to accumulate this body of knowledge. Whereas a lot of people, like, that's just not the case. They don't like give a damn. Like
oh yeah, I mean, I've spoken to people just like I meet at a bar or something. Oh, they'd find it tiring and exhausting. And frankly, I think, like, I love this stuff, but I'm kind of like, man, I wish I could be a bit more like you, because like it's kind of a sickness. I mean, Freud, I think, makes this point when you ask the question why you become neurotic. You've already got a neurosis going on. And I think you're right, but also this beautifully connects back to your original point. It's the fact that, like, material circumstances, like what it affords to us, right? Like, look, I'm not trying to be like, okay, not the whole elitist point here, but hey, Chomsky, he was like in MIT amongst like all of these scientists and intellectuals. Like his whole life was spent, well, partially with Jeffrey Epstein, but that's a whole other conversation. But also, doing his like, linguistics and cognitive science and all of these things where, by solving these like mini micro scientific problems, he gained like a sense of jouissance from it. But then what's interesting even there is, you see, for an anarchist, he was very much within an institution doing all of these things. So the fact that he couldn't even see that I could be this big, great intellectual and activist only because there's like this, like, to use a Heideggerian term, like these background practices that allowed me to do this in the first place. And I think this is precisely some of the critiques of even the new atheists, where they didn't realize that for them to like do this like intellectual atheistic project, there were many other things that came before it. And I think the really good philosophers, folks like, I would say here, Wittgenstein, even from like analytic philosophy, understood this really well, that it's not just like there's something before the cogito. It's not just you're here and then you start like thinking. A lot more that come. You're like, as Heidegger would say, you're thrown into the world. So, yeah, beautifully put. And I think even though you don't really get into like phenomenology and stuff in this piece, I would love to like. I for sure would say this piece was kind of like a phenomenology of religion in many ways, for me at least.
The piece, the spiritual but not religious.
Correct. Yeah, that essay. Yeah.
Yeah, intended to be a sociology of religion. And I would say like
and a good one.
A lot of my work is heavily sociological. Like
sociological. Yeah.
It's but yeah, there's
Tony. Speaking of go ahead. Sorry.
I don't know how much time you got, by the way, because I do have like a decent amount, so it depends on you, like how long.
I've got to get to work in 10 minutes, mate. Unfortunately.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All good. Maybe I should just like wrap up like two things.
I do want to maybe wrap up your thoughts, but my last question would be just simply when you conclude, you say here, none of this should be taken as a simple call to go back, quote unquote, go back to traditional religion, as if the past several centuries of social transformation could be reversed through institutional reform or moral revival. And I think that's an important point too, because this piece isn't you just trying to say, let's go back to the good old days.
Yeah, that's great, because that was one of the qualifiers I wanted to clarify. So the first thing I wanted to clarify is the defense of the church, because the Orthodox, right? They don't view the Pope as infallible, so why not Orthodox? I mean, there's a reason I find Orthodox interesting. I think it's the most compelling alternative to Catholic tradition. However, what you tend to see though with Orthodox Christianity is that it really splinters across nations. It really tends to fragment based on the ethnicity, meaning that which is surprising, because there is a church authority. So why is that? Well, what tends to happen with the Orthodox Church in every country is
it's very interesting. I never thought of that.
It gets subordinated to the political authority of that country. So it's if you look at the Orthodox Church in Ukraine versus Russia, they actually say different things. One of them justifies the war, the other one doesn't. And it's well, if the thing about the beauty of the Vatican in Rome is that it's the oldest government in history. It's subservient to no government, right? The whole point is that by having the infallibility of the church is precisely that the government can't just tell us what to do, that's pretty important, because then you're able to establish a central narrative, a central sort of decision that's adhered to by Catholics across the world, as opposed to what you get with various different Orthodox that tend to be very ethnically fragmented. I mean, you even see it in the composition of churches, where it's if you look at the most multi-ethnic churches, it tends to be the Catholic churches, whereas Orthodox, it really depends on the type you're going to. Are you going to the Coptic? Are you going to a Ukrainian, Russian, Greek Orthodox? It really depends. Or Armenian, they have their own thing going on. So that's to me a kind of a political strength of the Catholic Church. But now to answer your question about is all my rationality of religion the material reality of morality? Am I saying we should go back? And why do I say we shouldn't, or this is not a call to go back? So I put that in there not just to make my progressive readers and audiences not feel too scared, but it's also because I don't want to create the illusion that you can go back. You can only go forward, but going forward doesn't mean accepting the way things are or rationalizing the way things are. And I have my critique of conservatives, and what I would say conservatives and progressives, and people on the left and right tend to fall into these camps of some kind, which is progressive thinking, or as I would say, progressive and reactionary thinking. So progressive thinking tends to celebrate whatever happens as a good thing, that it's a progress, right? Even if it's a symptom of decay, they tend to literally treat some symptoms or problems as not symptoms or problems, that it's not a problem, that's to be celebrated, right? Childlessness, this is good, or whatever, liberation, celebrating decay as progress. Conservatives bemoan problems and identify problems, but usually mistake the symptom for the cause. So, conservatives will look at the decline of traditional morality. They'll say, oh, the problem is that traditional morality is not taught in schools. Well, I'll tell you something. I always technically taught traditional morality in school, and no one gave a damn. None of us gave a shit. When I was in high school, I didn't care. I was atheist. I was experimenting with everything. It didn't stop me, and it didn't a lot of people I noticed there were some genuinely religious people in our school, but a lot of people were just kind of and we got to wonder, why has traditional morality, why has divorce gone up, why have what do we also have this kind of certain sexual culture that we have? I mean, a lot of it is downstream of material conditions, economic and sociological conditions, which is the conditions for a religion are just objectively harder, in the sense, or for a while they were, at least. So to answer your question, also tie one of the earliest points I made the point about the way in which this base and superstructure interact, and I mentioned how there was the base is changing in such a way now, the economy, that's actually leading to the revival of Christian morality. So I think this is a great way to tie it all together beautifully, which is, if you look at like, okay, how did capitalism lead to all that solid melting to air, as Marx described, right? Well, what happens is people have to increasingly migrate to cities to find work, and capital goes where people are, because that's where they can sell goods to, and you have overdevelopment of some areas, and the lack of development in other areas, massive inequalities, people also literally leaving their areas to go find opportunity in these big cities. So you also get like less stability due to that, due to people having to move, mobility. You also get, this is really fast forwarding a bunch of stuff here, but like the technological innovations lead to massive social transformations. So the development of automobiles and airplanes, but more so automobiles, was the biggest factor. It was what caused the first sexual revolution. The one that was really more significant than the second one, which was the one of the 60s, caused by largely, a mixture of birth control, the invention of the pill, and also, women entering the workforce, no-fault divorce, various stuff like that. But really the more significant one's actually the first one, which is automobiles. No one thinks you can reverse automobiles, but like automobiles made it so like, the idea of like cheating and like casual sex, like all that's way more possible.
A lot easier.
Yeah, way easier, of course. And that's not necessarily entirely bad, right? Because then it's like you have more, I guess, like, you're not as like pushed into something by force, I guess, like, you're not as like limited. So there's some level of like, there's a dialectic, like, but then how much freedom is too much freedom, right? When you have like unlimited choice, like on the internet with these apps or whatever. But anyway, you had like basically the conditions that led to more mobility, people being able to interact, led to essentially, more casual sexual views, but also decline of religion in terms of stable communities. You get this really aggressively on steroids when you have essentially the development move to consumer economy in the post-war era, when you have like an economy predicated on consumption. Well, no longer does the Protestant work ethic make any sense. You want to teach people to be guilty, not for enjoying too much, but for the opposite. So you get all that. You get ideologies that mesh very well with like the rise of marketing and all these industries that need to be created to essentially convince people to buy shit that they might not necessarily need. That's why Christians were some of the biggest opponents of advertising when it was first getting around in the 20s. But by the 60s, it's really like normal feature of life, as this is the dominant part of the economy. And you have, essentially like ideologies that come to rationalize these conditions. Airplanes changes drastically as people can fly to different areas, choose where they want to move. And what accelerates the mobility even further is the internet. So like when you have the internet, people are far more connected with each other across the world and anywhere else than any time in history, right? And that, in some sense opens the opportunities for mobility. And mobility leads to, more atomization in some sense, because you're more deterritorialized from any sort of community, as Deleuze would used to say. So like you have more deterritorialization in general. Also, there's this whole like globalization of the economy by itself is deterritorializing. The interconnectedness meshed with the kind of individualist consumer ideology, which meshes well with this, like individualism, atomized individualism meshes well with that. Then you get the gig economy, the more latest stage of capitalism, which is like individualism on steroids, right? But you had the ideologies, and it's important to remember, ideologies on both the right and left often play some level of like rationalizing these tendencies. Like, while leftists were celebrating like, the sexual revolution and like, female integration into the workforce and like, decline of marriage and motherhood is like some kind of liberating thing. It was the right who is celebrating, essentially the decline of stable employment by saying, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Oh, you have the freedom to choose your job. And it's, Reaganism was essentially this sort of like individualist push that is pretty much more or less what people like Gary Vaynerchuk or like these new age Stoics advocate. So like, but what has changed now in the recent day? So I think what's funny is the internet, while it at one stage led to the interconnection of the world, it's actually now leading to the isolation of the world. with algorithms, you get people living in those sort of like custom universes. So you have more atomization, but also which is in some sense accelerates the a-religious trend. But it's accelerated this to such an extent where I think people just literally like have such an uncurable yearning for community, like stable friend groups. They want to also like meet, people of the opposite sex in like ways that aren't like dating apps or whatever. And, there used to be like third places that were more common, but with the internet, like third places are less necessary. And also with the internet, people don't even really have to like socialize. So like there's a breakdown of socialization where like people needed to fucking be somewhat like normalized to integrate in third places and meet people, where now you can just meet your like crowd in these little echo chambers and in all these places. So you just have like a kind of like what you're getting is a bunch of like Peter Pans, and like I saw a recent article that was written that said Peter Pans and cat ladies is like what like the new societies are producing, which is more or less male female equivalent of the same phenomenon, which is like delayed permanent adolescence, delayed maturation. And a lot of that's because of the conditions are making it so it's like less necessary. It's not compelling people to. It's allowing people to delay life. But at the same time, people are becoming so isolated and so desocialized that they're actually living literally austere lives. So far from like living excessive hedonistic lives, people are not literally drinking less, like in terms of Gen Z, drinking way less than any generations before. They are like partying less, they're going out less, they're socializing less, they're living more austere lives. So then, the sort of like desire for, austere morality seems to kind of like in some sense make sense of their conditions in a way that it might not for the late millennial or the Xer who grew up watching, Friends or like, How I Met Your Mother or like Sex and the City, which is also an interesting show in its own right. But like, these shows where like, I think there's a reason why you don't really have these sort of normie shows anymore in the same ways, because these normie shows kind of resemble like, here you can integrate into society if you play a role and choose one of these characters. But now everyone's like living in their custom universe that like people are more separated. So it's creating a yearning for community, but also at the same time, like austere values like function with that. So it's like, in some sense, we're literally 360ing, from what was happening prior to the first sexual revolution. You went from a society where automobiles allowed people to move and get out the place. Now people aren't getting out the place because they just can live in their custom reality online. They're all like inside. They're just terminally online. And, in some sense, it's like a territorialization rather than deterritorialization. People are re-territorializing. And it's not really in a good way, is it? But it has led to the rationale of Christianity more than ever. And I think it'll continue to grow as the substitute for Christianity and like religion more broadly plays itself out, which is as spirituality without religion, as I articulate in that Substack piece, plays itself out, as people don't really get fulfilled from this like these temporary like spiritual copes. People will like, I think, crave something bigger, especially something where you're there in person. Like the thing that's like pretty powerful about like Christianity is like, even if you don't enjoy going to church, like even if you're like, oh, I'd be better off at work, if this is like kind of like a duty, right, and you like it becomes a ritual, well, it's like
and a thing that lasts too, not just in person, but a thing that has a phylogeny and a history.
Yeah, it connects you into a broader purpose. Like it fulfills the three functions of religion that I mentioned in spiritual but not religious, which is, on the one hand, religiate, to bind people through rituals, being people in the present through solidarity. The third function of religion, which is sort of like a heart and a heartless world, the sort of religion is cope. And that's the function that spirituality plays, minus the other two functions, which is why it's not very effective. But it's still like something that matters. Like people want meaning, sacrifice, but the thing about meaning and the thing about beliefs is they don't really like matter if other people don't believe them too. It's like, if like you're with people who believe the same thing, there's a thing that binds you together. There's something like validating about the belief in the way that if you believe it internally, there's always going to be a part of you that like doesn't really believe it. Do you know what I mean?
At
least in a stronger way. And also, like, whether or not you believe it, what really matters is like what you do. You know, if you act like you believe it, it matters more than if you believe it, right?
This is the Pascalian sense and the Durkheimian sense. Tony, man, I hate to abruptly end this, but that was a beautiful way to tie it all up.
Yeah.
I think with the three main points of the article, that was fantastic. I'll obviously leave it all in the show notes. I want to say this though before we conclude, only because I've got to get to work, unfortunately, man. I have two things that I probably like to organize. One is kind of a discussion on Catholicism and accelerationism, kind of those two ways of viewing in our contemporary times. And the second thing, perhaps I'll reach out to Peter too, because I've spoken to him a couple of times, is perhaps a discussion, if I could moderate with Peter on kind of your point of view from as a Catholic and then Christian atheism. But all that being said, man, thanks so much for the work you do. And
way
this
more
has been
well informed than me, probably on those matters. My disagreement probably literally just be like, I don't know. Like, he probably might be right, but does his worldview work for most people, or for even most Christians?
Of course. Yeah. No, I mean, just as a chat. But look, Tony, thanks a lot, man. This has been wonderful. I've learned a lot from One Dimes. As I was telling you, I started watching a couple of years ago with the Burnout video. Look, I hope this is the first of many more conversations to come.
It was a pleasure. I'm absolutely down.